Hello everybody, Carl here. Welcome to my astrology video for November 2012. A little correction here. Last month, for some reason, I was under the impression that there were 3 eclipses in a row and I was going to do a composite for 3 eclipses. Okay, turns out there are only 2 eclipses. They're both in November, so this month's video is based on the usual composite chart for November. And this month's video, well, November is definitely a good news, bad news month. But it's also a kind of Rorschach test. The first thing that jumps out at you is that there is a string of very, very difficult events in the heavens. And they cover a good deal of the month. Not the whole month, but they do pretty much cover a lot of it. Now, if we focus on those events, it's going to bum us out. Oh my God, what are we going to do? But if you focus more on the larger, the bigger picture, on what's going on in the background, you'll see an awful lot of very powerfully constructive events going on in the heavens. And you need to be aware of that. So let's get through the difficult aspects without freaking, and we'll wait for the good news and try to put them in perspective. Okay, I'll have a couple of words at the end of the video. This, of course, is the composite chart for November 2012. But I think the astrology of November 2012 is best understood by 1, looking at a series of specific aspects that span the month, and then placing these aspects in a broader astrological context. Also, we need to think of these individual aspects as the bad news part of a bad news, good news story, because when we place these aspects in the broader astrological context, I think you'll agree that they tell us a more upbeat story than you might assume if you just paid attention to the individual aspects. Mercury will go stationary retrograde in Sagittarius on the cusp of the 5th and 6th houses on November 6th. Communications, transactions, bureaucratic and legal processes stall out. Delays, postponements, cancellations, and schedule changes become the norm. Confusion, ambiguity, and general uncertainty increase. All that good stationary retrograde Mercury stuff. Old business and long delayed issues will reach closure. Stuff we've been waiting for in the mail will finally arrive, for example. People will install brand new software, and people will upgrade or update their existing operating systems, and so on. All that kind of thing. And, as often happens during a retrograde Mercury, reliable, up-to-date information will suddenly become scarce. Decisions will have to be put off. We probably also want to keep in mind that Mercury will turn retrograde at 6:04 p.m. Eastern Standard Time during the general election in the United States. So, unless things go just right, this stationary retrograde Mercury could cause, let's just say, delays in the election results or irregularities. It doesn't really bode that well. I'm not sure it really means that something's going to go wrong, but this and the aspects we're about to discuss kind of bring that idea, that possibility to the fore, the possibility of problems with the election results in the United States. On 11/11, Neptune will go stationary direct in Pisces in the 9th house near the midheaven. With Neptune moving forward, ideological issues, spiritual issues, questions of personal aspiration are resolved. Any doubts we may have been having will begin to fade. People will feel better able and more willing to move forward, more confident in their beliefs, in their convictions. However, for a few days before and after its station, Neptune is going to compound the problems caused by the stationary retrograde Mercury. The uncertainty and confusion will peak. It will increase briefly but exponentially as a result of the kind of overlapping stations of Mercury and Neptune. I also think we should expect higher levels of impatience, even exasperation, because we're going to resolve our own aspirational issues. We're going to resolve our own resolve, so to speak, but we're going to be doing that at a time when things are slowing down. So we're firming up our resolve, we're solidifying our commitment with the direct Neptune, but Mercury retrograde is slowing everything down. A recipe for frustration. So we start off our little narrative, our little aspect-based narrative, with a simple humdrum, run-of-the-mill retrograde Mercury. Then we notice that this retrograde Mercury, this stationary retrograde Mercury, is occurring at a very crucial moment in the U.S. elections. And then we notice that the stationary retrograde Mercury occurs a couple of few days before a stationary direct Neptune. So, you see, it's already getting pretty complicated there. We've got a very complicated vibe going. A couple of days after Neptune's stationary direct motion, we have a total eclipse of the sun in Scorpio on the cusp of the 5th and 6th house. A solar eclipse in Scorpio will bring sudden shifts and unexpected events that affect all 8th house matters: taxes, inheritances, births, deaths, especially as these things affect important interpersonal relationship decisions, and we'll have more to say on that later. But the point is, we have stationary retrograde Mercury, a couple of beats, a couple of days later, stationary direct Neptune, a couple of days later, boom, a total eclipse of the sun. So you have a decision, an event, like an eclipse, that's going to call for quick, decisive action amidst mounting confusion. To make a long story short, the surprising, the unexpected effects caused by the solar eclipse will compound the confusion and turmoil caused by the direction changes on the part of Neptune and Mercury, or vice versa. Now, as if that weren't enough, the very next day, Mercury retrograde in Sagittarius squares newly direct Neptune in Pisces. The Mercury-Neptune square will further compound the confusing, disruptive effects of the change in planetary direction and the total solar eclipse. And right there, that takes us pretty much to the middle of November, and this roiling, nonstop, mounting confusion and turmoil goes right to the middle of November. It pretty much accounts for the whole first 2 weeks of November. The Mercury retrograde Neptune square occurs on 11/14. Then we get a bit of a break. Things will probably calm down, clear up, sort of. But then it starts in again. On 11/23, Mars in Capricorn squares Uranus retrograde in Aries on the cusp of the 11th house. This square will release uncontrolled, angry, violent expressions of resistance and independence on an individual and a collective level. There is a strong possibility of riots, civil unrests, and outbreaks of warlike violence somewhere in the world. And it's likely to really provoke people who are already on edge. So on 11/23, things heat up. The Mars-Uranus square is reinforced by some nasty supporting aspects and a void of course moon that occur on the same day, on the Friday after Thanksgiving, the 23rd of November. So let's just say there are clouds gathering over the Thanksgiving weekend. We might want to exercise a little bit of caution and have some backup plans. We get a little bit of good news. On 11/26, Mercury is stationary direct in Sagittarius on the cusp of the 5th and 6th house. Order and clarity will begin to return. Day-to-day events will begin to resume their normal pace, at least with respect to the speed, the clarity, and the reliability of communications. Having just completed its square to retrograde Uranus, Mars conjoins Pluto. On the 27th, Mars conjoins Pluto in Capricorn in the 7th house, close to the descendant. This can bring out explosive expressions of temper, anger, sheer outrage, and belligerence. We are looking at some very dangerously disruptive, violent vibes at the end of November. But we still have one more tricky aspect to go in this very tricky series of very tricky aspects. On 11/28, the very day after the Mars-Pluto conjunction in Capricorn, there's a partial eclipse of the moon in Gemini in the 12th house. We're expecting sudden, unexpected events or crises that bring about the rejection of outdated or self-limiting attitudes and the release of deep, self-defeating fear and anxiety. Now, that's kind of convoluted there, but really what it means is we're expecting issues, events that shock people out of their complacency, their smugness, or rigid and counterproductive habits of mind. So another shocker, another disruptive aspect closing out this series. So the first half of November, we're looking at confusion, uncertainty, impatience, deception is a possibility, poor communications are very likely, and they will be complicated by the sudden, unexpected surprise events brought about by the total solar eclipse. Or, conversely, all of this confusion and uncertainty will aggravate whatever untoward, unfortunate events are triggered by the eclipse. And all of this happens on or very near the general election in the United States. So there is definitely reason to be concerned about electoral problems in the United States. Not a guarantee of disaster, but definitely reason for concern. Then, the second half of November, we have these really fiery, dangerously explosive, dangerously volatile aspects involving Mars, Uranus, and Pluto. And the stationary Mercury, stationary direct Mercury, and a partial eclipse of the moon. All of this clustered in the 4 or 5 days following Thanksgiving in the United States. So we're talking about very explosive vibes. We're talking about the possibility, or in some parts of the world, the great likelihood of unrest, of violent warlike behavior on the part of people. So November shapes up as quite an eventful month, full of confusion, turmoil, frustration, unexpected and possibly, in many cases, unpleasant events, and hot tempers. Now, before moving on to the good news portion of this video, and there is good news, I wanted to look once again at some of these aspects to show us where they strike in the composite chart so we get some idea of the kinds of themes that will be played out in November. So the question is, where do these troubling, disruptive astrological events strike November's composite chart? And the answer is in places that strongly affect all relationships in complicated and very concrete ways. The Mercury and solar eclipse activity strike in Scorpio on the cusp of the 5th and 6th houses. And I think you'll agree that the 5th and 6th houses really strongly affect relationships in a very practical way. The 5th house, of course, is the house of friendship, or romance. It's also the house of youthful friends, children in your life. And the 6th house is the house of concrete transactional kinds of relationships. You work for me, I pay you. I pay you, you do such and such for me. It's a kind of fee-for-service contractual kind of place. And both of these things, the 5th house and the 6th house, strongly affect how we relate day to day on a very practical, nitty-gritty dollars and cents kind of way. As I just said, these events are happening around the cusp of the 5th and 6th houses. Now, these things do affect relationships, but they're kind of transitory. They're not particularly intimate. You've got romance and friendship. You've got work relationships, transactional fee-for-service, quid pro quo kind of things. They're day-to-day, they're passing things. But then you have to take note of the fact that these events are taking place in Scorpio. And Scorpio brings in the permanent, the long-term, the heavy-duty commitments that span decades, that indeed span our entire lives, sometimes. For example, the 5th house represents children in our lives. The 8th house represents reproductive sexuality, childbearing, and the deeper, long-term, lifelong responsibilities that exist between parents and children. Much heavier stuff. But in this chart, they're overlapping. You've got the day-to-day stuff overlapping with the lifelong stuff. Serious business here. And, of course, you have all of these very important astrological events taking place there. So you've got a fairly big release of powerful, transformative, and maybe disruptive energies taking place at a point that strongly affects, powerfully affects many, many, many important aspects of virtually all of our relationships. Really. All of this points to radical changes in romantic and work relationships, which are in turn related to changes in reproductive sexuality and long-term, large-scale financial concerns, pensions, insurance, social welfare programs, and other matters involving the transfer and distribution of wealth and power between individuals, between generations, between citizens and governments. Very heavy stuff. Also very concrete and very immediately effective. It's going to affect people's heads right away. And it's also going to directly, immediately concretely affect how and why people relate to each other, how they structure their relationships, how they behave in relationships, what their expectations are, and what relationships they choose to have or not have. And while some of these things and their implications will strike us right away and fairly clearly, these aspects are setting in motion very intricate, delicate, complicated processes of negotiation on an emotional, a mental, a financial level that will take quite a while to play out and over time will dramatically reshape the social and economic and political landscape we all live in. The fiery, explosive Mars-Pluto activity strikes Capricorn in the 7th house near the descendant and not too far from Juno in the 6th house. The stuff we discussed just previously that's going on the cusp of the 5th and 6th houses affect secondary and tertiary kinds of motivations in relationships, the practical, important but practical side of our relationships. This energy hits the core, the bond itself, the feeling of love and friendship, the passion between people. And we notice that Juno is involved too. It's a little below the descendant there in the 6th house. Juno's involvement is telling us that however this explosive energy, this really critical energy manifests in our lives, it is going to affect the deepest, most important, fundamental aspects of our most important relationships on a long-term basis. It will be the effects of these aspects in our lives will affect the understanding between us. It will become part of the unspoken, unwritten understanding between people in long-term substantive relationships. The Mars-Uranus-Pluto interaction that is going on at about the same time will add a disruptive drive for personal liberation to the mix of motivations that are playing out, that are affecting events on these days. So a common thread going through all of these intricate, intimate, complex negotiations and renegotiations, a common thread will be a need for greater personal independence, self-expression, freedom of movement. A couple of other important placements bring up very similar, related themes, and we'll discuss those in a moment or two. The energy of the eclipse at the new moon hits in Gemini in the 12th house near the south node, Lilith, Jupiter, Vesta, and Ceres. And you notice all these bodies relate to wealth, shared wealth, nurturance, and so on. But this placement is telling us that we should not rely on ideology, religious dogma, legal abstractions, abstract principles, entrenched attitudes and ideas about these nurturance issues. Instead, we should take a north node solution and work them out concretely, anew, in our lives with other people in the moment. Don't fall back on abstractions and dogma. Work things out afresh in the face of new and emerging realities. Here now is one of those other aspects that I said enhances or elaborates or adds to our understanding of the thrust, the direction, the meaning of the aspects we just discussed. Neptune and Chiron are in Pisces on the midheaven. This placement tells us that people are seeking looser, more flexible interpersonal bonds, bonds that will allow them greater freedom of movement, of personal movement, more space to heal, more space to explore in the realm of ideas, in the realm of ideals, in the realm of spirituality. People need more space. And here is the second placement I wanted to talk about. Venus in Libra is close to Saturn in Scorpio in the 5th house. This tells us that relationships are passing through what I think can best be called a platonic phase, or in more familiar language, a celibate phase. People want relief from the burdens and complexities of physical relationships, of sexual relationships, to work out emotional and spiritual issues and to make changes accordingly. And they don't really feel they can do that when they are involved physically, intimately. Once again, people are going to need space. Let's summarize what we just discussed, summarize the bad news portion of the chart before we begin our discussion of the good news. Okay, November opens with a barrage of confusion, some of it profound and vexing. It closes with a high energy burst of impatience and determination, but also potentially of anger, of outrage. The planets are demanding that we seek greater clarity about and deeper commitment to our goals. We need to be sure about our plans for the future and be sure they are not dictated by rigid, outmoded attitudes, habits, and practices. These energies are basically going to pick us all up by the scruffs of our neck and shake us. Do you want to do this? How badly do you want to do it? Are you serious? As a result of everything that's going on inside and outside, people are going to want to make deep, comprehensive, lasting changes in relationship areas, in all aspects of all relationships, in line with these new economic and personal realities. So expect moments of truth, moments of difficult truth. Expect points of no return, and you might also expect a judgment of history or two. History is going to tip its hand and tell us what it wants and what it doesn't want. When you get eclipses involved like that with the moon's nodes, you know that the planets are revealing their opinions, their expectations, their preferences. The good news really begins to emerge when we put this running train wreck in November into broader astrological context. Now, in September, at the fall equinox, people began to make choices, and they began to realign their personal and professional alliances in accordance with these choices. In October, people began to build, to expand on these commitments. People entered into all kinds of agreements for the future. They made all kinds of promises and commitments to themselves about the future. They started things. There were millions upon millions of new points of departure. In November, the planets are examining our motives and testing our resolves. And they are pushing us to break out of old patterns, to refine and revise our goals, to deepen our commitment. And they are doing this partly by showing us the consequences of our ways, good, bad, and ugly, good, bad, and indifferent. And they are showing us exactly the depth, the breadth, the complexity, the intricacy, the difficulty of the changes we have to make in our lives to realize these potentials. Now, it's not always a bad thing we're talking about here. We're not always talking about agonizing over the details. We're talking about realizing what we must do to achieve the prize that we have envisioned for ourselves. Now, here is the good news per se. Okay, we've been over this numerous times before. There were 3 major planetary ingresses between January 2008 and February 2011. These were extremely disruptive and near catastrophic. They are very frightening, really rough stuff. The ingresses were eventually completed, but we entered a time of continual turmoil. Everything was fluid. There was no clear sense of direction. Events were affected by powerful energies that were easily misdirected and subject to gross abuse. In September, we began to get a grip. We picked a direction and we began to go with it. To that extent, at least, the uncertainty, the indecision, the stalemate, the chaotic stagnation or stagnant chaos began to abate. Sober, rational, clear-minded Saturn took over rulership of the new planetary arrangement in October, establishing new, helpful relationships among the planets, among each other and with Saturn, and making the situation much more constructive, much more manageable. The results are more stable world conditions, conditions that are more amenable to reason and common sense, and we are better able, as a result, to plan for the future and successfully guide events. Saturn joined the North Node in Scorpio, and the North Node moved into Scorpio at the end of August. The combination is very, very powerful. I discussed Saturn's entrance into Scorpio and its new power in the zodiac last month, October. I'm going to say a little bit more about that placement in this video, and in months to come, there'll probably be even more. There's just too much going on with this Saturn move to put it all into one video. Saturn in Scorpio is in mutual reception with Pluto. Those in power will be more likely to listen to reason under this arrangement. A proper balance of economic and political power will be restored. There will no longer be quite such an acute imbalance of power between those in the front office and those on the front lines. Saturn is also in sextile relationship with Pluto. This will further support respectful, sensible, realistic, successful negotiations between those on the front lines and those who hold power. And those of us who have suffered from this power imbalance, suffered from the inability to speak openly, realistically, sensibly with those we work under, we will discover, we will receive a significant degree of relief under this arrangement. It will no longer just have to suffer in silence or bite our tongue. We can expect more productive dialogue between ourselves and those over us. Saturn is in trine relationship with Neptune also. Ideals are more likely to be rational and to harmonize more readily with reality, with real conditions, with conditions on the ground. And given what we just discussed about Saturn and Pluto, these ideals will probably play more helpfully, more constructively into negotiations between the powerful and the not so powerful. Saturn sets in Aries' 8th house. So Saturn in Scorpio rules or governs Aries. And it therefore also governs Uranus in Aries. Another important plus, Uranus is exalted in Scorpio. This will further enhance relations between Saturn and Uranus, and it will enhance the planetary pattern as a whole, really strongly enhancing the potential for constructive change and reform. Saturn, Pluto, Neptune, and Uranus are all in strongly positive relation to each other. This will take the edge off the Uranus-Pluto square, which, as we know, can be troublesome. It will lessen the possibility of confrontation between the powerful and the disempowered, and favor compromise and mutual accommodation. The North Node is also in generally favorable aspect. Circumstances will naturally push people in the direction of desirable North Node solutions, that is, shared solutions for shared problems. And because eclipses are, the location of eclipses is determined by the moon's nodes, the results of eclipses, the sudden, unexpected, sometimes catastrophic effects of eclipses, will favor the forward movement, will favor the advance of appropriate constructive reform. So there are all those scary aspects spread out throughout the month of November. But what the good news in this chart is telling us is that we can do away with disaster consciousness. We don't have to worry about the sky falling in on us anymore. There is an end to stalemate, indecision, and drift. We no longer need worry about these frustrating confrontations with authority that wear us down and lower morale. We don't have to worry quite so much about irrational and freakish behavior. These aspects will tend to lessen that sort of thing. And we can look forward to a decreasing influence on the part of demagogues and political extremists. We do have to understand these, what I just said, in relative terms. Not everybody's going to get with the program. And there's still a lot of disturbing stuff out there, stuff that's very difficult for people to cope with. So, as I said before, we're not talking about utopia in the twinkling of an eye. We're talking about the beginning of a long, probably drawn out, painstaking process. So all of those aspects I discussed in the first half of the video, the bad news of November, they are bad news taken in and of themselves. But if you look deeper into the structure of the chart, you see all of these positive, constructive energies that create opportunity, that generate positive potential. All the challenges of November and all the challenges beyond November will be much easier to meet and lead to far greater, more positive, constructive achievements if we jettison the baggage of negative emotions and attitudes that many of us have built up over the last several years. The fear, the bitterness, the anger. You have to let that go and look at the positive potentials inherent in this new astrological structure. I'm guessing that despite all my encouraging words about the big stuff, the big picture stuff in the background, all that good news, that people are still worried. I'm not putting it down, I'm just saying it's a human thing. How can we deal with these bad aspects? How can I insulate myself? How can I ensure that my life won't be derailed by all this stuff? I think those concerns are a little overblown, but I will address them. I mean, what are you going to do? You can't just put all that stuff out there and leave people worrying, right? Okay. My experience has been that it takes more than just a bad aspect to cause a difficulty in your life. You need one, the bad aspect. You need some bad karma. You need some bad luck. Maybe you need some bad habits and bad attitudes. In other words, you have to bring a lot of personal negatives to the negative aspect to really get a difficult outcome, a bad outcome. Most of us really don't have all those negatives hanging over our heads like that. And in addition, we have a lot of positives going for us. So, just don't focus on the badness of the bad aspect. Look at yourself. Look at your positives. Look at your strengths. Look at your good luck, say, your good karma, your good sense. Look at all the good things you have going for you and balance them against the bad aspect. And I'd say a great deal of the time we can kind of sidestep the worst of these things. Most of us can sidestep them most of the time. Next month, the sign-by-sign forecast, which will be available mid-November-ish on my blog, will be based on the usual composite chart. It'll be a normal monthly, December monthly kind of chart. December's big picture analysis, both on the blog and in the video, will be based entirely on the 2012 chart. I did an analysis of the 2012 chart some years ago. Very, very fascinating chart. Really, really fascinating. But I really think it's a time now for a second look. There's been a lot of water under the bridge. I've learned a lot about astrology. I also understand what people need and want to know more, so I can address those things more directly. But we are also standing well within the time frame covered by that chart. We're standing in that cosmic space, and I think that will give us a deeper, a greater feeling for what's going on with those vibes. Okay, so we'll see you next month. Thanks for tuning in.